Welcome. My name is Rose, and I'm the Program Manager for the Scott County Historical Society. Today we're going to take a deep dive into Scott County and the Civil War. So we'll look a little bit at some of the issues that led up to the Civil War in the United States, what was happening in Minnesota at the time, look at what life was like in Scott County during the time of the Civil War, and introduce you to some of the folks from Scott County who were impacted by or fought in the Civil War. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are. The Scott County Historical Society has its home in a museum in downtown Shakopee. We offer a research library where you can look into genealogy as well as county history, rotating exhibits, and in normal times, host programs and events throughout the county for all ages. We also have a 1908 historic house on site where we offer tours, programs, and events. You can see our contact information here, and you'll also be able to see it at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions as you watch or any questions about local history, don't hesitate to give us a call. You can search through our collections online, and you can also email us at info@scottcountyhistory.org. Now to start out with, we're going to take a look at Minnesota. Minnesota officially became a state in 1858. This was 3 years before the onset of the Civil War, and at that point, Minnesota had been a territory for less than 10 years. This was also coming at a period of rapid change for the state and for the United States as a whole. The United States was expanding westward very quickly. Western territories were becoming states, and the idea of manifest destiny was rapidly becoming the accepted reality for the nation. Looking at Minnesota, the world of the Dakota and Ojibwe people in the state was changing rapidly as well. The treaties of 1851 had vastly reduced the territory of the Dakota national homelands. The Dakota had also been part of centuries of economic change. Specifically, the fur trade had become an economic cornerstone of the Dakota and the Ojibwe as changes in the United States disrupted traditional practices. By the mid-1800s, this fur trade had virtually ended. Now, the trade dried up due to changes in the global economy, but for the Dakota and Ojibwe, it led to hard decisions, which often ended in the ceding of land. To make matters worse, as part of those land cessation treaties, fur traders had added documents stripping the Dakota of the promised annuity money. This was a no-win situation that led to a war between the United States and the Dakota happening in Minnesota alongside the U.S. Civil War. Now, the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 was one of many wars that was being fought between the United States and American Indian nations at the time, as the rapid expansion of the U.S. pushed into indigenous homelands. These conflicts are often taught about in an entirely different chapter in a history book from the Civil War, but in the eyes of U.S. soldiers at the time, they were intertwined. For soldiers from Minnesota and other western states, joining the U.S. military might mean service in either conflict, the Civil War or the U.S.-Dakota War, and veterans of the Civil War, especially those from the upper Midwest, sometimes fought in both wars during their time in service. Now, looking at the United States as a whole, maps like this one give us the idea that white Americans' attitude toward slavery was simple, divided in a line between a north-south split. The reality was far more complex, and you can see this reflected in the 1860 election that immediately preceded the Civil War. So rather than a two-way election between Lincoln and Douglas, as you often see this contest portrayed in the history books, the contest was a four-way split. And although the South had not officially left the Union, they furnished their own candidates, which showed the divide that was already in place in the nation. Additionally, though the practice of slavery was a key issue in the 1860 election, the candidates' views did not neatly divide along abolition lines. It's also important to note that the party platforms of the Democrats and the Republicans have changed many times throughout American history, so you can't put the weight of modern party platforms on historic candidates. So here to the far left, we have Stephen Douglas, and he was the candidate for the Northern Democrats. So his platform emphasized that individual states and territories should be able to make up their minds about whether they allowed slavery, and that the federal government should not interfere. Next, we have John Breckinridge, who was the candidate for the Southern Democrats. Now, Douglas and Breckinridge represented a split in the Democratic Party over the state of Kansas. Douglas thought that Kansas should enter the Union as a free state, while Breckinridge thought it should be a slave state. Next, we have Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln did not campaign for abolition or changing the status of slavery in existing states that allowed slavery, but he thought that no new territory should be allowed to join the Union as states that allowed slavery. And this included territories that had allowed slavery that were interested in pursuing statehood. Lincoln was not initially beloved by the abolition movement, who thought he was a little bit too permissive towards enslavement. Finally, we have John Bell. So John Bell was the candidate for the Constitutional Union Party, and this party had its roots in the recently defunct Whig Party. The party's platform was to avoid secession by adhering to no law or principle other than the U.S. Constitution on all issues, including slavery. After secession, the Union Party split as well. Bell eventually joined the Confederacy, but many constitutional Unionists stayed loyal to the Union. Now, the results of the 1860 election are telling. The North went firmly towards Lincoln, the South supported Breckinridge, and the so-called border states were split between Douglas and Bell. For an election story that's often told as Lincoln versus Douglas, Douglas actually only took a single state, Missouri. Now, zooming into Scott County, you can see the results are even more mixed. So here's a county map of the state of Minnesota showing the results of the election of 1860. Most of Minnesota voted for Lincoln, but you can see even though it was surrounded by a sea of red, Scott County actually voted for Douglas. So let's take a closer look at Scott County. In 1860, at the time of this election, Scott County was a relatively new entity. The county was officially established in 1853, but it was vastly reduced in territory in 1855 due to a conflict between Scott and Dakota counties. In 1860, the county had a European American population of approximately 4,595, although we don't have an accurate historical count of the American Indian population in the county at the time. The communities that we know today in the county were newly formed too. So Shakopee, Belle Plaine, and Jordan were platted in 1854, New Prague in 1856, Savage in 1857, and Newmarket in 1858. Of these, only Shakopee had officially been incorporated as a village when the Civil War broke out. Now, at the time of the Civil War, Shakopee did have a village council and was moving towards economic growth. Newspapers noted actually in 1928, though, that the council had disbanded when the war was declared and only took up again in 1867. Transportation of goods and people in and out of Scott County was limited as well. A railroad charter was granted to the Root River Valley and Southern Minnesota Railroad Company in 1855 to bring the train into Scott County, but construction was stopped due to the financial panic of 1857. The railroad, which was now under the purview of the Minnesota Valley Railroad Company, wasn't actually completed until 1865. A ferry across the Minnesota River at Shakopee opened in 1853, and a stage line between St. Paul and Shakopee opened the same year. Now, the stage line ran along ox cart trails that were actually originally Dakota roads, and we still use sections of these roads today. We now know them as parts of Highway 13, 169, and 101. The first steamboat attempt on the Minnesota River was made in 1842. This boat made it from Fort Snelling to the Dakota town that would later be called Shakopee. This was the first of several expeditions between 1842 and 1850, each reaching farther down the river. Now, these weren't necessarily serious trips. Many of these expeditions had the air of a big party. Prominent government leaders and business officials would be on board, and copious amounts of drink and food and even bands would be there to liven the mood. Now, outside of bringing people and news, eventually steamboats became a major part of the economy of these early river towns, and boat building was a big business. A prominent riverman of the 1850s once said that a steamboat represented a $20,000 to $40,000 investment, so a huge amount of money, and the average life of a riverboat was only 5 years, but a boat could pay for itself in 2. Now, the 1857 territorial census of Belle Plaine, and this was before the town was even incorporated as a borough, listed 11 men with the occupation of boatman. Today, we sometimes don't even think of Belle Plaine as a prominent river town. Now, we do think of early European Americans in Scott County as primarily farmers, but in truth, even during this time, the population just grew too quickly to entirely feed itself. The towns along the river depended on shipments of flour and other foodstuffs that were coming in along the rivers. Later, the flour milled in the county would be shipped out, and other foodstuffs shipped in along the rivers and along the new railways. Now, every boat in the river had a bell, and it was said that residents in the communities along the river could tell what boat was arriving based on the tone of its bell. Finally, once the Civil War began, steamboats would take many of the men that volunteered or were drafted into the Union Army to Fort Snelling and St. Paul for training. Now, if we look at the people in Scott County, most of the European Americans that were in Scott County at the time of the Civil War were immigrants from Germany or the Czech Republic, or sometimes more commonly, the children of immigrants from these counties who were coming in from elsewhere in the United States. They were drawn by the promise of a community that shared language and cultural traditions, and after 1862, by the promise of the Homestead Act, which gave the possibility of land ownership to recent immigrants from Europe. Many of these families were engaged in agriculture or in other industries connected with the river, brickmaking, milling, and boat manufacture and repair. Now, we think of slavery in the United States as an institution almost entirely removed from the northern states and instead focused on the South. But in reality, slavery was a part of life in Minnesota as well. So I'm going to tell just a few stories that demonstrate the impact that slavery had on Minnesota and on this part of the state. So the first story I want to tell is that of Dred and Harriet Scott, and you can see their portraits to the far left on this slide. They're arguably the most famous case of enslaved people in Minnesota. So Dred Scott was an enslaved man who was brought to Fort Snelling and then sued for his family's freedom on the grounds that slavery was illegal in Minnesota. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court and actually resulted in the now overturned ruling that Black people in the United States, free or enslaved, were not citizens and therefore could not sue in a court of law, and therefore the case was invalid. Now, a famous case of slavery in Scott County is that of Joseph Godfrey, and you can see a sketch of him to the right on this slide. Godfrey was born into slavery around 1830 near Mendota. So he was the son of an enslaved woman known as Courtney, who was brought to Fort Snelling. And you see a parallel between Dred Scott and Joseph Godfrey's lives here. Officers in the Army were allowed to bring enslaved people to posts in both southern and northern states, regardless of whether slavery was legal in the region they were going into. That's how Dred Scott ended up in Minnesota and Joseph Godfrey as well. Now, these officers were actually given financial incentives by the military to do this. The idea was that if the officer enslaved someone, then they would not press enlisted soldiers into maintaining their households. Now, Godfrey was eventually hired out to fur traders along the Minnesota River. And this doesn't mean that he got a job with the fur traders and was receiving wages. Instead, it meant that his owner hired him out to the fur traders and then was collecting wages on his behalf for the work that he did. Eventually, he came to Scott County, where he suffered ill treatment and ran away. He joined the nearby Dakota community, where he married a daughter of Wapah Duta, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, in 1857. And when the U.S.-Dakota War broke out in 1862, Godfrey fought alongside the Dakota, and when the war ended, he was actually the first person to be tried by the Military Commission on September 28, 1862, determining war crime status. He did get a harsh sentence, but eventually his sentence was commuted to 10 years imprisonment. And after he was released, Godfrey settled with the Dakota in the Santee Reservation in Nebraska. He remained there for the rest of his life and passed away from natural causes in 1909. Now, the last story I want to tell you is that of Mary and James Griffin. So we don't know Mary's original last name, but she was born enslaved around 1825 in Virginia. And when Mary was a young woman, she was attacked and became pregnant. And after giving birth, she and her child escaped to Pennsylvania, where she met and married James Griffin. Now, James had also been born enslaved, but he actually had a unique circumstance. His owner was drafted into the U.S. Navy and did not want to serve, so he sent James in his place. Now, a few, and I want to put an emphasis on few here, enslaved people who served in the military were given their freedom, and James was one of those lucky few. While in the Navy, he also trained as a carpenter and eventually became a shipbuilder in Pennsylvania. One of the ships he helped to build was the Minnesota Belle, and when it was ready, James, Mary, and their 3 children decided to travel with the boat, which was headed to Blue Earth, Minnesota. Now, at the time, it was common to see steamboats around the country crewed by a mixture of free and enslaved African Americans. And there's an interesting narrative of race I want to note here. When you're reading historic documents from this time, you sometimes have to read between the lines when you're looking at free and enslaved African Americans because the, quote, polite euphemism of servant was used for both free and enslaved Black people in records at the time. So when we're looking at the Griffin family's journey on the Minnesota Belle, the boat stopped early in Shakopee because it couldn't get over the Carver Rapids. So James and his family settled in Shakopee in 1854, and James took a job with Daniel Storer. First worked as a carpenter and then as a teamster, helping immigrant families settle in the new territory. Now, as a Black man, James was not allowed to claim territorial land, but his stepdaughter could pass as white. So eventually the family claimed land in Wright County under her name, and they eventually settled near Buffalo. Now this story shows two things. The first is that slavery, though illegal, did play a part in daily life in Scott County. Secondly, it shows the huge numbers of obstacles, including enslavement, the difficulty in running away, military service, skin color, laws, and many others that a Black family would have had to overcome to be part of the land boom that was taking place in Minnesota at the time, hence the scarcity of Black settlers in the state. This was the situation in Scott County. Moving back to national news, before Lincoln even took office, 7 states had seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy. Their reasoning was that Lincoln's policy of not allowing new states to allow slavery violated the Constitution. Now, the outgoing president, Democratic Buchanan, decried this secession, but tensions were mounting, and in April of 1861, the first shots of the Civil War were fired. And you can see a few headlines from Scott County newspapers here. During the war, we have the byline of the Scott County Argus, "Liberty and Union, now and forever, one and inseparable." And up here in the upper left, we have the Union Forever flag, and that's also from the Argus in 1861. So let's look at Scott County's response to the Civil War. Now, the response in the county might not be what you expected. The county was in general fully in support of the Union and ready to go to war. They named the South traitors, and they were angered by secession. But much of the blame for the secession was actually put in local newspapers on abolitionists. Popular opinion, according to newspapers at the time, was that abolitionists had supported the end of slavery, and if instead they had supported the Constitution, then the country would not have been forced into war. So I have a few quotes from the Scott County Argus during this time. This is December 14th, 1861. Quote, "Abolition is the primary cause of our difficulty, not slavery. Slavery is constitutional, abolition is not. Slavery is entitled to be left alone within its sphere, and abolition arose and assailed it." Another quote, this is from January 18th, 1862. "The conservatives and abolitionists are now arrayed against each other. The former laboring to preserve the Union, the latter would move heaven and earth to bring destruction and disgrace upon our country." And then finally a quote from March 8th, 1862. "We fully agree that one of the basest developments of modern times is the conspiracy of abolitionism. The country will see by and by that abolitionism is the vilest excrement that ever be served to the body politic." Now, to modern ears, those quotes may seem a little bit shocking. So there are a few things that I want to point out. Firstly, it's important to note that we really have limited firsthand accounts from Scott County during this time. Most of what we know comes through the county newspapers, meaning that it always would reflect the bias of the owners of the newspaper. On top of that, newspapers at the time were not necessarily neutral news sources. They were commonly published along party or political lines. We also don't know the feelings of the individuals who served in the Civil War from Scott County, or often the feelings from the families they left behind. This is what we do know. Minnesota was the first state in the nation to volunteer troops to fight on the side of the Union during the Civil War. Over the course of the war, around 650 soldiers from Scott County served in the Union Army, which is a massive number of individuals from a county that had less than 5,000 residents. So next I'm going to share some of the stories of the soldiers from Scott County who fought in the war, as well as the stories of some of the people at home who were impacted by the conflict. Now, the first person I want to introduce you to is John McConnell. So John McConnell was born in Ayr, Scotland in 1846, and you can see a modern picture of the town at the top of this slide. His family immigrated to the United States in 1849. They initially lived in Pennsylvania, then moved to Iowa, then Illinois, eventually coming to Minnesota in 1854. When the family arrived in Minnesota, they settled at Fort Ridgely. Now, Fort Ridgely had actually been built a year earlier in 1853, and it was built with a very specific purpose: to clear lands formerly owned by the Dakota from American Indians for European American resettlement. John's father was employed by the government to build boats and run a sawmill at the fort. Now, after 2 winters at Fort Ridgely, his family had saved up enough money to move to Blakely Township to farm. In 1862, after the Civil War broke out, John McConnell's father enlisted in the 8th Minnesota. At age 17 in 1863, John McConnell himself enlisted in Company C of Brackett's Battalion, the Minnesota Volunteer Cavalry. He served with them until the end of the war. So a little background on Brackett's Battalion. They were recruited in the fall of 1861, and they actually served longer than any other Minnesota Union unit during the Civil War. The men of Brackett's Battalion were recruited as the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd companies of the Minnesota Volunteer Cavalry, and the captain of the 3rd company was, unsurprisingly, Alfred B. Brackett. Now, during the winter of 1861 and 1862, the companies were stationed at Benton Barracks near St. Louis, Missouri. Conditions were rough, and many of the men fell ill. In 1862, the regiment was assigned to garrison duty in order to aid in their recovery. They garrisoned at Forts Henry and Hyman in Tennessee for over a year. During that time, they escorted prisoners and ran dispatches. They also repaired telegraph lines. Occasionally, they did some scouting for enemy forces and occasionally engaged Confederate guerrillas. In June and July of 1863, the regiment participated in the Tullahoma campaign. In a little more than a week, the Army of Cumberland drove Confederate forces out of the Middle Tennessee. In 1864, the unit was sent home on a 30-day furlough. Because of ongoing conflicts with the Dakota and the aftermath of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, Brackett and Governor Alexander Ramsey arranged for the cavalrymen to be reassigned to the Department of Northwest. The veteran soldiers were reorganized into a new battalion, and new recruits were enlisted to fill the ranks. Major Brackett was given command, giving the unit the official name Brackett's Battalion. So they began their 2nd chapter of service in February of 1864. The Union joined General Alfred Sully's army for the Northwestern Indian Expedition into the Dakota Territory. This expedition was the continuation of a punitive campaign against the Dakota begun in 1863. It was also an effort to remove Dakota people who were living in areas that blocked access to routes that connected to the gold that had recently been found at the Missouri headwaters. And during this time, John McConnell actually fought alongside his father, who had also been stationed out west. The battalion spent the winter of 1865, ironically, back at Fort Ridgely, and in May and June of 1866, the men were finally mustered out. So after returning to Minnesota after his tour of duty, John McConnell moved back to Blakely, where he became a farmer and lived out the remainder of his life. He was married and widowed 4 times, and he and his first wife, Julia, had 7 children, and she died during the birth of an 8th. John McConnell was active in the Masons for 50 years and also a dedicated member of the GAR. So this picture, what you can see on the slide, was taken in 1940. Now, a little information about the GAR. GAR stands for Grand Army of the Republic, and it was a fraternal organization made up of Union veterans from the Civil War. So it was founded in 1866 in Springfield, Illinois, and grew to include hundreds of posts across the nation. The GAR lasted until 1956, when it was dissolved at the death of its last member, Albert Wilson of Duluth, Minnesota. The GAR became among the first organized advocacy groups in American politics, supporting voting rights for Black veterans, promoting patriotic education, and helping to make Memorial Day a national holiday. It also lobbied the United States Congress to establish regular veterans' pensions. At its peak, membership was about 410,000, which was in around 1890. The GAR's political power grew during the latter part of the 19th century. It helped elect several U.S. presidents, beginning with the 18th, Ulysses S. Grant, and ending with the 25th, William McKinley. 5 Civil War veterans and GAR members, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Harrison, and McKinley, became presidents of the United States. Now, the next people I want to introduce you to are James and George McNeely. And unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of them, but I do have photographs of their grave sites in Belle Plaine that include headstones that were actually put up by the GAR. So James McNeely enlisted in the 1st Minnesota Company C at age 22, and he's noted for being the first person from Belle Plaine to enlist in the war. He fought in the Battle of Bull Run and was shot twice and actually stabbed with a bayonet, but survived and was taken prisoner. So a little bit of context on Bull Run. Bull Run is sometimes considered the first major battle of the Civil War. It was fought on July 21, 1861, about 25 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. Both Union and Confederate forces had about 18,000 troops, but most were new and poorly trained. And both armies ended the battle sobered by the fierce fighting and many casualties. Before this point, many people thought the war would be done quickly and that the other side would be finished. But they realized after this battle the war was going to be much longer and bloodier than had earlier been anticipated. Now, the First Battle of Bull Run highlighted many of the problems and deficiencies that were typical of the first year of the Civil War. Union units were committed piecemeal, attacks were frontal, and the infantry failed to protect exposed artillery. Additionally, intelligence was minimal, and neither commander was able to employ his whole force effectively. Now, James McNeely remained in prison for the remainder of his time in service, finally coming home in 1863. Unfortunately, he never recovered from his injuries and passed away on January 1, 1866. Now, James's younger brother George also served in the Civil War. He was in Company 1 of the 8th Minnesota, and he enlisted in August of 1862, soon after his 18th birthday. He served the full war, but like his brother, it took a toll on his health. He returned home but died on September 8, 1868. Now, the next person I want to tell you about is Emsley Hamilton. And this is the GAR photo that I showed to you earlier, and you can see Emsley Hamilton as a veteran sitting in the front row. Now, like James McNeely, Emsley Hamilton was in the 1st Minnesota. He was born in Quincy, Illinois, but moved to Minnesota as a young man. And almost immediately after his arrival in the state, the Civil War broke out. He enlisted in Shakopee. Also, like James McNeely, he was taken prisoner and spent 9 months in Andersonville Prison. Now, Andersonville Prison is a hard story and a conflict full of hard stories. Andersonville, or Camp Sumner, as it was known officially, held more prisoners at any given time than any other of the Confederate military prisons. During the 14 months it existed, more than 45,000 Union soldiers were confined here. Of these, almost 13,000 died from disease, poor sanitation, malnutrition, overcrowding, or exposure to the elements. The first prisoners were brought to Andersonville in February of 1864, and during the next few months, approximately 400 more arrived each day. By the end of June, 26,000 men were penned in an area originally meant for only 10,000 prisoners. The largest number held at any one time was more than 33,000 in August of 1864. Now, by this point in the conflict, Confederate resources were dwindling. Many of the U.S. railroad lines and most of the manufacturing at this time had taken place in the North. Additionally, food crops were more likely to be grown in the North and Midwest, while the South at the time was focused more on trade or cash crops. With the embargoes that were in place during the Civil War, the South couldn't sell these goods, and it was struggling to adequately feed and supply its own troops. With this in mind, the Confederate government could not provide adequate housing, food, or clothing, or medical care for their federal captives. When the war ended, Captain Henry Wirz, the prison's commandant, was arrested and charged with conspiring with high Confederate officials to, quote, impair and injure the health and destroy the lives of federal prisoners, and, quote, murder in violation of the laws of war. Now, in honesty, no evidence of such a conspiracy ever existed, but public anger and indignation throughout the North over the conditions at Andersonville ran high. He was tried and found guilty by a military tribunal, and Wirz was hanged in Washington, D.C. on November 10, 1865. He was the only person executed for war crimes during the Civil War. Now, both Emsley Harrison and James McNeely were in the 1st Minnesota, and this unit is known throughout the state and has received national recognition for the role they played in the Civil War, both for their bravery in battle and actually because of a soldier named Charlie Goddard. So Charlie Goddard enlisted in Winona, Minnesota when he was only 15. He's not just known for his service, but he's specifically known because of his diligence in writing home to his mother. He wrote almost every day, and of these letters, 110 have survived. This means that through Charlie's eyes, we know quite a bit about the daily life of this unit, what they did to pass the time during long stretches in camp, how poor the food was. For example, Charlie particularly complained about finding worms in his biscuits, and how scary it was to be lying in a field hospital. Now, Charlie missed the Battle of Bull Run because of dysentery, but he recovered and fought with the rest of the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg. He was wounded in his left shoulder. After the injury, illness, and poor food during his time in the Army, Charlie never fully recovered, and he died at age 23 in 1868. Now, speaking of Gettysburg, the 1st Minnesota is perhaps best known for changing the tide of the battle at Gettysburg. During the second day of fighting, the unit was sent to keep Confederates from taking control of Cemetery Ridge, a small outcropping and a weak spot in the Union lines. The 1st was ordered to charge the Confederate troops and hold the line for 5 minutes until backup could arrive. They ended up holding the line for 15 minutes. Now, this may seem like a small span of time, but during the charge, 215 members of the 262 men who were present in the 1st Minnesota at the time became casualties. This includes the regimental commander, Colonel William Covell, and all but 3 of his captains. The unit's flag fell 5 times and was raised again each time, and today that flag is displayed in the rotunda at the Minnesota State Capitol. The 82% casualty rate of the 1st Minnesota stands to this day as the largest loss by any surviving military unit in U.S. history during a single day's engagement. Now, this charge is giving credit for churning the tide of Gettysburg, which was in turn a decisive battle in ensuring Union victory. A monument to the 1st Minnesota now stands at the Gettysburg battlefield, and you can see a photo of it here, and it bears the following inscription. On the afternoon of July 2, 1863, Sickles' 3rd Corps, having advanced from this line to the Emmitsburg Road, 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, numbering 262 men, were sent to this place to support a battery upon Sickles' repulse. As his men were passing here in confused retreat, 2 Confederate brigades in pursuit were crossing the swale. To gain time and bring up the reserves and save his position, General Hancock in person ordered the 8 companies to charge the rapidly advancing enemy. The order was instantly repeated by Colonel William Covell, and the charge was as instantly made down the slope at full speed with the concentrated fire of the 2 brigades, breaking with the bayonet the enemy's front line as it was crossing a small brook in the low ground. There, the remnant of the 8 companies, nearly surrounded by the enemy, held its entire force at bay for considerable time until it retired on the approach of the reserve. The charge successfully accomplished its object. It saved this position and probably the battlefield. The loss of the 8 companies in the charge was 215 killed and wounded, more than 82%. 47 men were still in line and no man missing. In self-sacrificing and desperate valor, this charge has no parallel in any war. Among the severely wounded were Colonel William Covell, Lieutenant Colonel Charles P. Adams, and Major Mark W. Downey. Among the killed were Captain James Perriam, Captain Lewis Miller, and Captain Waldo Farrar. And the next day, the regiment participated in repelling Pickett's charge, losing 17 more men killed and wounded. Now, the next person I want to introduce you to is Horace Strait. So Horace Strait was born in Pennsylvania in 1835 and moved to Scott County in his early 20s. He initially planned to farm, but soon realized there was a business opportunity in providing supplies to the immigrants that were coming to Minnesota in droves at the time. Within a few years, he'd opened a general store in Shakopee. Now, in 1862, he enlisted as a private in Company 1 of the 9th Minnesota, and during training, he was promoted to captain of Company 1. So the 9th Minnesota was made up of recruits that enlisted in Minnesota during the summer and fall of 1862. They fought primarily in the Western theater of the Civil War, initially being sent to guard railroads against Confederate guerrillas. In 1864, the unit joined an expedition against Confederate forces in northern Mississippi, and they fought well, but the battle was a Confederate victory. There were few casualties in the 9th during that battle, but 233 of the men were captured, and many would later die in Andersonville prison. Now looking at Horace Strait, in 1864 he was promoted to major, and he served at the close of the war as an inspector general to the staff of General Andrew MacArthur. He was honorably discharged in 1865. Now, General Andrew MacArthur is better known probably as the father of General Douglas MacArthur. He's also known for serving as the military governor of the American-occupied Philippines under President McKinley. Now, Horace Strait left the Army in 1865. In 1866, he was appointed as one of the governors for Minnesota's first, quote, hospital for the insane at St. Peter's. At this point, Strait clearly saw a future in politics. He was elected as a Republican to the 43rd, 44th, and 45th Congresses, but failed in his re-election bid in 1878 to the 46th Congress. However, 2 years later, he was elected to the 47th and then re-elected to the 48th and 49th Congresses. During his time in Congress, Strait was known as being a man of few words but working behind the scenes, and in fact, he was given the nickname the tongueless wire puller by a rival. What measures he dealt with included mostly handling public lands. Strait pushed that they be open to further European American settlement. He also favored the expansion of railroad systems. And his long congressional career finally came to the end over a tariff dispute. He had supported a tax on goods coming in from Canada during a time when the southern half of the state was looking for cheap Canadian lumber. Facing almost certain defeat, he chose not to run in 1886 and returned to Shakopee, where he became president of the First National Bank. He died in 1894 on a train route to Mexico, where he had been seeking warmer climates to help with his failing health. At the time of his death, the editor of the St. Cloud Times, C.F. MacDonald, who'd served with Strait in the 9th, ran an article, quote, "We remember him when, raising a company of volunteers in 1862, we enlisted with him, then followed 3 years' service in the Army, in camp, on march, and bivouac, in battle, and on retreat. For it is in the latter position that a soldier best exhibits his mettle in every place, at all times, under all circumstances. Captain and later Major Strait was as brave a soldier as Minnesota has ever sent into the field." An instance of this, the following incident in reference to his conduct at the Battle of Nashville, is taken from the history of the 9th Regiment. It was the afternoon of the second day. Hood's forces were in full retreat. The history of the 9th Minnesota Regiment says, Major Strait, with part of the regiment, was in far advance of the line, chasing a considerable body of Chetham's men, when a brigade staff officer galloped up and exclaimed, "My God, Major Strait, you cannot capture Hood's whole army with that handful of men." The gallant major halted, looking at the rapidly retreating Confederates, and replied, "No, I guess not. They can run a dang sight faster than we can." At the end of the war, the regiment historical noted, "There were few braver or more efficient officers in the Army than Major Strait." Now next I want to introduce you to Major Harrison Peck. So Peck was born in November of 1842 in Vermont, and he grew up there, and at age 19 enlisted there. He enlisted in Company F, 1st Regiment of Barton's U.S. Sharpshooters in 1861. He fought with the Army of the Potomac from the First Battle of Bull Run to Gettysburg. The Army of the Potomac was the principal Union Army in the Eastern Theater during the Civil War. This meant that Peck was at both battles of Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, the Maryland Campaign, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. Now, after Gettysburg, he was discharged for disability, having had a series of seizures or a stroke. He attended law school in New York and then moved to Minnesota in 1865. He took the bar in Scott County, where he would work for several firms, eventually becoming the counsel for the Minnesota Valley Railroad, which he remained involved with until his death. Peck also had a career in politics. He served a term as state senator. He was mayor of Shakopee for 8 years, county and city attorney, and briefly owned the newspaper, the Shakopee Argus. And you can see Peck here on the far right with this picture of the GAR post. Peck died in 1913 in Los Angeles. He had gone to stay there after a bout of illness, hoping the warmer climate would improve his health. Now, Peck is buried in Valley Cemetery in Shakopee, and his tombstone is engraved with lines from the poem Bivouac of the Dead, bivouac being a semi-permanent military camp. This poem was written by Theodore O'Hara, a native of Kentucky, in order to honor his comrades who died during the Mexican-American War. O'Hara was actually part of the Confederacy, but the poem was used on memorials to both Confederate and Union soldiers, and it's even quoted on the entrance to Arlington Cemetery, though O'Hara is not credited in that quote due to his time in the Confederacy. The full poem is 12 stanzas, but the first reads, "The muffled drum's sad roll has beat the soldier's last tattoo. No more on life's parade shall meet the brave and fallen few. On fame's eternal camping ground their silent tents to spread, their glory guards with solemn round the bivouac of the dead." Now, the next person I'd like to introduce you to wasn't a soldier. Her name was Sarah Wakefield. Now, although Sarah Wakefield did not fight in the Civil War, she has a fascinating story, and her story in Minnesota was playing out alongside the battles of the Civil War. She was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1830, and she moved to Minnesota in 1854. In 1856, she married John Wakefield, a doctor who was well known in Shakopee at the time. Now, soon Dr. Wakefield was appointed as a doctor to Yellow Medicine Indian Agency, and he was there when the agency was raided during the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. In this attack, Sarah and their children were taken captive. They were held for about 6 weeks in a place that would eventually come to be known as Camp Release. Now, after she was freed from captivity, Wakefield penned a narrative of her time entitled 6 Weeks in Sioux Teepees, a Narrative of Indian Captivity. In 1863, she testified to a commission defending the Dakota man Chaska, or Wichankwautandopi, again, I apologize if I pronounced this incorrectly, who she said had protected her and her children during their captivity. In spite of this, Chaska was one of those executed in December of 1862 in the largest mass execution that ever happened on U.S. soil after the U.S.-Dakota War. Now, Chaska was not actually slated for execution. He was taken by mistake, and Sarah maintained until her death that this wasn't actually a mistake. It was a malicious move on Governor Sibley's part as a result of her testimony in favor of the Dakota. After their release, Wakefield was reunited with her husband, and the family moved back to Shakopee. Dr. Wakefield died in 1874. After his death, Sarah Wakefield moved to St. Paul to get better schooling for her children. At the time of her death, she resided in St. Paul with her son John, and she was buried at Valley Cemetery in Shakopee. Now, many historians connect the U.S.-Dakota War directly to the Civil War. First, the delay in annuity supplies and payments that led to the start of the fighting in the U.S.-Dakota War was delayed by the Civil War raging to the east. The Civil War also meant that at the time of the U.S.-Dakota War, there were many soldiers already being recruited into the Army. There are also those that claim the Dakota actually chose to start fighting during wartime because they hoped the Civil War would take precedence and they would have a better chance of being successful in their aims. Now, the next person I want to introduce you to is Albert Beer. So Beer was born on February 14, 1841 in Pennsylvania. And when he was 2, his parents moved to St. Louis, Missouri. 6 months later, they moved to Burlington, Iowa. And he came to Minnesota with his folks in 1856. He lived in Scott County for the rest of his life, with the exception of his service in the U.S. Civil War. It was noted in his obituary that he was, quote, proudly educated in the public schools of Iowa and Minnesota and trained in the business of farming. He enlisted on October 25, 1862 at age 21 with the 8th Minnesota Infantry, Company I. The 8th Minnesota was a unit that saw conflict in both the U.S. Civil War and the wars going on between the United States and American Indian nations at the time. So they were mustered at Fort Snelling between June and September of 1862 and originally sent to guard European Americans during the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. In 1864, the unit was sent with Brigadier General Alfred Sully's punitive Northwestern Indian expedition against the Dakota. After this, the unit moved eastward, eventually fighting in the Third Battle of Murfreesboro. And after moving inland from March 7th to 10th, 1865, the unit fought in the Battle of Wise Fork in North Carolina. This unit is actually noted for traveling more miles during the war than any other Union unit, and it was finally mustered out on July 11, 1865. Now, Beer served with the unit throughout, and here you can see his picture as part of the GAR photograph. He mustered out with the remainder of the unit in 1865. After the war, Al Beer moved back to Jordan, Minnesota, where he bought and sold agricultural equipment. He remained a bachelor and eventually was known in the community as Dad Beer. He died on March 22, 1915. Of this, the Jordan Independent said, quote, "Veteran Al Beer will ride no more as marshal of the Memorial Day Parade. Taps sounded for him early Monday morning, and he mobilized with the mysterious legions on the other side of the dark river, whence none return." And as you can see from this photograph, like many other veterans from Scott County, Albert Beer was involved in the GAR. The next soldier I want to introduce you to is Ernest Bosling. So Bosling was born in Hanover, Germany in 1847. In 1856, his family moved to Belle Plaine. In February of 1862, he enlisted at Fort Snelling with a note saying that he was 18 and had his parents' quote, "full consent and permission to enlist in the United States Army for 3 years or during the war." He was 15, and it is unknown whether his parents actually wrote the note or whether Ernest wrote it himself. After enlistment, he was sent to Fort Abercrombie, where he fought in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. In May of 1863, Company D left Minnesota and joined up with the rest of the 5th in Mississippi for the Vicksburg campaign. They helped capture Jackson and then moved on to Vicksburg. The siege of Vicksburg lasted 40 days before they finally surrendered on July 4, 1863. During this fighting, Bosling became sick and was sent to Camp Sherman, where he died on September 10th in 1863. He was 17. He has a stone in Oakwood Cemetery in Belle Plaine that reads, "Juvenile Hero." The stone is only a marker, and Ernest Bosling is buried in Vicksburg. Now, Ernest Bosling's parents were Christian and Sophia Bosling. Sophia Bosling was born on May 20th, 1815 in Hanover, Germany. As a young woman, she and her husband Christian traveled to the United States and settled in Belle Plaine, and Ernest was their only child. Sophia decided to keep her son's memory alive after his death in the Civil War through charitable works. Her husband died while she was in her 60s, and afterwards she inherited some money from her brother, and she used this money, including money she'd saved from Ernest's pension, to create an institution to provide housing for orphans and the elderly, which she named The Home. Sophia herself moved into the completed facility, and the home was dedicated just 2 days before her death on November 8, 1898. The home still exists. Today it is known as the Lutheran Home Association and runs several retirement centers in Scott County. Memorial Day 1915 marked the 50-year anniversary of the Civil War. So we're going to go over some of the ways that Scott County celebrated this event and remembered the soldiers who'd lost their lives in the Civil War as a closing to this talk. So first I want to look at Jordan. Now, the Jordan Independent noted on June 3, 1915 that, quote, "There have been at Jordan during the last 40-odd years many Memorial Day observations, but those who remember back for many years tell us they do not recall any that surpassed the 1915 occasion." The town brought in a speaker, Charles Fowler of Minneapolis, who reminded them that, quote, "Memorial Day is taken as a true manifestation of the patriotic spirit of our people, as well as a sincere measure of respect to the memory, in particular, of the brave Union soldiers present and departed." Fowler also praised Jordan, noting that there were upward of 100 men who enlisted from Jordan, and that few villages the size of Jordan could point to a better record. After the speech was a parade and then a performance by the Jordan Brass Band. Finally, there was a parade of the Von Minden Post 105 of the GAR, marchers from the ladies of the GAR, the Jordan Fire Department, and then all of the pupils of Jordan Public Schools in a long procession lined up by grade level. The citizens of Jordan followed behind in a parade of carriages and automobiles. And the parade finally ended at Spirit Hill Cemetery with more music, a church procession, and time to decorate the graves of Jordan's veterans. Now, Shakopee also celebrated in grand style. The day started with a gathering of the GAR accompanied by buglers, a drum corps, and children carrying wreaths and bouquets. The entire group walked to Valley Cemetery to decorate the gravestones of soldiers. At 1:30, a parade formed at the courthouse, starting with a band and followed by the city police and a procession of Shakopee school children. This group was followed by representatives from labor unions from around the county. The parade traveled to Bridge Square to pay their respects to a group of Union veterans who waited there. The Shakopee Tribune noted on June 3, 1915 that, quote, 50 years have wrought changes both in appearance and numbers of our boys in blue, yet their hearts seemed young once again as they beheld the honors paid to them and the memories of their comrades that are gone. Times changed too, for the streets were filled with autos instead of with teams, and there was not even one horse in the whole line of the parade. Finally, the day in Shakopee concluded with a free meal being served to GAR members and their families in celebration. Now, it's unsurprising that the anniversary was held in such esteem. Scott County sent around 650 soldiers to the Civil War, which was a huge number in a county that had less than 5,000 residents. Most families would have had a personal tie to someone involved in the war. Not only this, but the veterans that remained were aging, and there was a widespread push in the county to honor their memories and preserve their stories. The 50th anniversary of the Civil War also came during a time of a great deal of national change, as the Shakopee Tribune alluded to in their coverage of the Memorial Day Parade. Technology was changing rapidly as cities were booming and more Americans were working in factories instead of fields, and social change followed with campaigns for labor rights and women's suffrage. With so much in flux during the president, many of Scott County residents found it important to honor the past. 1915 itself brought conflict, too. Less than a year before the Memorial Day celebrations honoring the Civil War, World War I had begun in Europe, and while the U.S. was still several years away from joining the fight, the specter of the war must have seemed very real to the American people. World War I might have seemed particularly relevant to Scott County's large German population. In 1915, Scott County newspapers actually still carried a weekly column entitled News of the Fatherland, which gave a summary of weekly events transpiring in Germany. As the war progressed, and with it anti-German sentiment, this column disappeared. Many Scott County residents still had strong ties to Germany, and they might have felt deeply the prospect of a divided nation on the horizon once again. Now, the Shakopee Argus, in their coverage of Memorial Day on June 3, 1915, was accompanied by an article entitled Memorial Day Lessons. And the article concluded with this warning, and I want to conclude the talk with this quote as well. Quote, "From the lips of the thoughtless youth, we sometimes hear the flippant charge that the old soldiers are still fighting the battles of the Civil War, little realizing what they mean to the scarred survivors of these epic-making days. Who that marched with Sherman to the sea could forget? Who that came back from the slippery slopes of Gettysburg could ever forget this tragedy? Who that witnessed the destruction by the Confederate Army itself of its last hope and stronghold, the city of Richmond, in that memorable April of '65 will ever forget the indescribable scene of horror? 30 city blocks swept out of existence by searing flames, while hundreds of hospitals and almshouses inmates were said to have been blown to eternity. Such is war. God forbid our land will ever know another." So thank you for taking the time to listen to our talk today. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can find the Scott County Historical Society online at scottcountyhistory.org. You can also find information there about our exhibits and our library and some other programs that are taking place. You can also email us at info@scottcountyhistory.org. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.